Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation of a Warrior. Bruce Mercer wasn't born ruthless. Life forged him that way. Growing up in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania, he learned early that the world respected only strength. His father, a steelworker who drank away his paycheck, taught Bruce his first lesson in betrayal when he abandoned the family on Bruce's 15th birthday. His mother, Minnie Mercer, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, her hands cracked and bleeding from cleaning office buildings until dawn. "Never trust anyone completely, Bruce," she'd whispered during one of her rare moments of rest. "People will disappoint you when you need them most." At 18, Bruce enlisted in the Army Rangers, seeking purpose and brotherhood. The military became his religion, discipline his prayer. He excelled in reconnaissance and psychological operations, earning respect through calculated brutality in combat zones across Afghanistan and Iraq. His teammates called him the Glacier, calm on the surface, devastating when he moved. During his 3rd deployment, at a USO event in Qatar, Bruce met Roxanne Morris. She was volunteering, her blonde hair catching the desert sun, her smile seemingly genuine as she handed out care packages. She laughed at his dry humor, listened to his stories with wide blue eyes, and wrote him letters that became his lifeline during the darkest missions. "You're different from other soldiers," she told him during a video call, her voice soft and admiring. "You have depth. You think before you act." What Bruce didn't know was that Roxanne had already dated 3 other servicemen that year. She collected military boyfriends like trophies, drawn to their structured lives and steady paychecks. But Bruce was different. He was intelligent, disciplined, and climbing the ranks quickly. He represented security, a ticket to a comfortable middle-class life. Their courtship was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as romance. Roxanne researched military culture, learning the language that would make Bruce feel understood. She sent packages filled with his favorite snacks, memorized the names of his teammates, and perfectly timed her emotional support to coincide with his most vulnerable moments. Bruce, starved for genuine connection after years of brotherhood forged in combat, fell completely. He proposed via satellite phone from forward operating base in Kandahar, the ring hidden in his gear for 3 months while he waited for the perfect moment. Roxanne said yes, her performance flawless as she sobbed with apparent joy. Inside, she was already calculating. Bruce had another year left on his deployment, plenty of time to keep exploring her options while maintaining the engagement as insurance. Their wedding was small but perfect, held in the chapel at Fort Bragg with Norman Bradshaw, Bruce's best friend and fellow Ranger, serving as best man. Norman had tried to voice concerns about Roxanne's sudden appearance in Bruce's life, but Bruce's happiness was so complete that Norman held his tongue. "She makes you smile, brother," Norman said during their bachelor party. "But remember, trust your gut. It's kept us alive this long." Bruce laughed it off, believing he'd found his anchor in the chaos of military life. Roxanne played her part beautifully, the devoted military wife who understood the sacrifices required. She joined spouse groups, volunteered on base, and maintained a social media presence that painted her as the perfect picture of patriotic devotion. But perfection was exhausting, and Roxanne began to crack under the weight of her performance. During Bruce's 4th deployment, she started frequenting a bar near the base where civilian contractors and off-duty personnel gathered. That's where she met Javier Irvin. Javier was everything Bruce wasn't: spontaneous, emotionally expressive, and most importantly, present. He was a freelance photographer who'd taken a contract documenting military family life for a magazine series. Tall and lean, with dark eyes and an easy smile, Javier represented freedom from the rigid structure of military life. Their affair began as emotional infidelity. Javier listened to Roxanne's complaints about military life, validated her feelings of loneliness, and slowly convinced her that she deserved better than waiting for a man who put duty before his wife. He was an expert at reading women, identifying their deepest insecurities and presenting himself as the solution. "You're too vibrant for this life," he told her during their 3rd clandestine coffee meeting. "You're wilting here, waiting for someone who might never come back." The physical affair started soon after. Roxanne justified it as emotional survival, convincing herself that Bruce had abandoned her by choosing the military over their marriage. She began to rewrite their history, painting Bruce as controlling and distant, building a narrative that justified her betrayal. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away, Bruce was leading reconnaissance missions in Syria, unaware that his marriage was disintegrating. He called Roxanne every few days, treasuring their brief conversations, sending her half his combat pay, and planning their future together. Norman noticed the change in Roxanne's letters before Bruce did. Her writing became colder, more formal. Her video calls were often canceled, and when they did connect, she seemed distracted, distant. But Bruce was so focused on completing his mission and returning home that he dismissed the signs, attributing them to the stress of deployment. The trap was already set. Bruce just didn't know he was walking into it. Chapter 2. The Perfect Storm. The call came on a Tuesday morning, Damascus time. Bruce had just returned from a 72-hour reconnaissance mission, his mind still sharp with adrenaline and exhaustion fighting for control. The satellite phone's distinctive ring cut through the pre-dawn quiet of the forward operating base. "Hey, beautiful," Bruce answered, expecting Roxanne's usual morning check-in. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough for his instincts to engage, that sixth sense that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. "Bruce." Her voice was different, flat, rehearsed. "I need to tell you something." In the background, Bruce could hear movement, muffled voices. His trained ear caught something else, guilt. It saturated her tone like blood and water. "I'm pregnant," Roxanne continued, each word carefully measured. "But it's not yours. It's Javier's, my ex-boyfriend from before we met. We've been seeing each other again. We're getting married." The words hit Bruce like sniper fire. Precise, devastating, completely unexpected. His grip tightened on the phone as his world reorganized itself around this new reality. Everything clicked into place. The distant calls, the canceled video chats, the subtle changes in her letters. "Bruce? Are you there?" He hung up. No words, no questions, no pleading. Bruce Mercer had been betrayed before, but never like this. Never by someone he'd trusted with his whole heart. His blood didn't just freeze, it crystallized into something harder, colder. Norman found him 20 minutes later, sitting in complete stillness, staring at the phone in his hands. "Brother, what happened?" Norman asked, recognizing the expression. He'd seen Bruce wear that exact look before eliminating high-value targets. "My wife is marrying someone else," Bruce said simply. "They're having a baby." Norman sat down heavily. He'd suspected something was wrong, but had hoped he was paranoid. "Jesus, Bruce. I'm sorry, man. What do you need?" Bruce looked at his oldest friend, his brother-in-arms who'd pulled him out of 3 different firefights and never once questioned an order. "I need emergency leave. For revenge." Norman should have talked him down, should have urged him to think rationally. Instead, he nodded. "I'll talk to Conrad." Master Sergeant Walter Conrad had been Bruce's mentor since basic training, a grizzled career soldier who'd fought in 3 wars and understood that some betrayals required blood to balance the scales. When Norman explained the situation, Conrad's weathered face hardened. "How long does he need?" Conrad asked. "As long as it takes," Norman replied. The paperwork was expedited through unofficial channels. Within 18 hours, Bruce was on a military transport to Germany, then a commercial flight to North Carolina. He used the flight time productively, his mind working with a methodical precision that made him lethal in the field. Bruce's first stop wasn't home. It was to a private investigator named Heather Sandoval, a former military intelligence officer who specialized in surveillance. Her office was a converted warehouse in downtown Fayetteville, filled with high-tech equipment and the kind of person who asked no questions as long as the money was good. "I need complete background checks on 2 people," Bruce told her, sliding photographs across her desk. "Everything. Financial records, communication logs, travel patterns, psychological profiles. I want to know what they eat for breakfast and how often they brush their teeth." Heather studied the photos. A blonde woman and a dark-haired man who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne advertisement. Timeline, 72 hours. Double my usual rate. Done. While Heather worked, Bruce conducted his own reconnaissance. He rented a nondescript sedan and began monitoring Roxanne and Javier's patterns. They were living together in an apartment across town. Their routine, predictable and domestic. Javier was weak. Bruce could see it in his body language, the way he constantly checked his phone, his need for constant validation from Roxanne. Roxanne had changed. She moved differently now, more confident but also more paranoid. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if she knew someone was watching. Her betrayal had given her a taste of power, but it had also made her aware that actions had consequences. The wedding was being planned quickly, a small ceremony in a park pavilion, followed by a reception at a local restaurant. Only 30 guests, mostly Javier's photographer friends and Roxanne's acquaintances from a base. She hadn't invited any of Bruce's friends or family, effectively erasing their shared history. By Thursday, Heather had delivered the files. Bruce studied them in his hotel room, his analytical mind processing every detail. Javier Irvin was exactly what he appeared to be, a freelance photographer with delusions of artistic grandeur, living project to project, charming women to support his lifestyle. He had a sister, Celia Delgado, who managed a gallery in Atlanta and was funding his photography career. But it was Roxanne's file that provided the real revelation. This wasn't her first military husband. She'd been married before, to a Marine named Eddie Eldridge who died in a training accident just 18 months after their wedding. The insurance payout had been substantial, and Roxanne had spent it on a lifestyle upgrade before moving to Fort Bragg to find her next target. Bruce felt something inside him shift, like a gear clicking into place. Roxanne wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a predator who specialized in military men. He'd been her mark from the beginning, another uniform to manipulate and exploit. The wedding was Saturday afternoon. Bruce spent Friday preparing, his movements deliberate and methodical. He made phone calls to old contacts, arranging favors and calling in debts. By sunset, everything was in place. Saturday morning, Bruce positioned himself across the street from the park pavilion, watching through binoculars as the ceremony setup began. Roxanne looked beautiful in a simple white dress, the same one she'd worn to marry him, he realized with dark amusement. As the ceremony began, Bruce made a single phone call. "It's time," he said simply. The black van arrived just as Roxanne threw her bouquet, the timing perfect and devastating. 3 men in dark suits emerged, moving with professional efficiency. They weren't gentle. Javier's scream was cut short as a hood went over his head. The guests scattered in panic as he was dragged into the van, his expensive camera equipment scattered across the pavilion floor. Roxanne's face found Bruce across the street, her eyes wide with terror and recognition. She screamed the words that would haunt her dreams. "What did you do?" Bruce smiled, his expression cold as winter steel. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3. The Art of Psychological Warfare. Bruce didn't answer Roxanne's screams. He simply folded his binoculars, got into his rental car, and drove away, leaving chaos in his wake. The wedding guests were calling 911, but Bruce knew the van would be untraceable, the men professional enough to leave no evidence. Roxanne would get no answers from the police, no comfort from the authorities. That was the point. Phase 1 of Bruce's revenge was psychological warfare, a skill he'd mastered in Syria, where breaking an enemy's mind was more valuable than taking their life. Javier's disappearance would consume Roxanne's thoughts, poison her sleep, and slowly drive her toward madness. By Sunday morning, Bruce had established a command center in a rented house on the outskirts of town. Norman had arrived from overseas, officially on leave, but actually serving as Bruce's second-in-command. Together, they monitored Roxanne's every move through a network of cameras and listening devices that Heather Sandoval had installed. "She's called the police 6 times since yesterday," Norman reported, reviewing the surveillance logs. "Filed a missing person report, contacted the FBI, even called the local news stations." Bruce studied the monitors showing Roxanne pacing frantically through her apartment. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and was slowly unraveling. What about Javier's sister? Celia Delgado flew in from Atlanta this morning. She's staying at the Marriott downtown, hired her own private investigator. Norman paused the video feed. She's not going to give up easily. Good, Bruce said, while Roxanne spiraled into panic. Bruce was methodically dismantling the foundation of her life. He'd hacked into her email accounts, social media profiles, and financial records, skills acquired during advanced reconnaissance training. Every secret she'd hidden, every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd orchestrated was now his to weaponize. The first strike came Monday morning. Roxanne's commanding officer at the base family support group received an anonymous package containing photographs of her affair, detailed records of her previous marriage and insurance fraud, and evidence of her targeting military spouses for financial gain. By noon, she was banned from all base activities and under investigation by military police. The second strike targeted her finances. Bruce discovered that Roxanne had been forging his signature to access his military savings account. With a few carefully placed calls to his bank's fraud department and military financial services, all joint accounts were frozen and Roxanne was flagged for identity theft. But it was the third strike that truly broke her. Tuesday evening, Roxanne received a package at her apartment. Inside was Javier's camera, the expensive digital SLR he'd been using to photograph their wedding, along with a single Polaroid photograph. The image showed Javier bound to a chair in an empty warehouse, very much alive, but clearly terrified. On the back, in Bruce's precise handwriting, was a simple message: he's alive. For now, you have choices to make. Roxanne's scream could be heard through the surveillance equipment from 3 blocks away. That night, she called Bruce's cell phone, the number she programmed into her contacts as My Hero just 2 years earlier. He let it ring 5 times before answering. Hello, Roxanne. Bruce, please, she sobbed into the phone. I know you're angry, but this is insane. Javier didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who lied to me for 8 months, who used my deployment to fuck another man in our bed, who stole my money to pay for your lover's art supplies. Bruce's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. Which part should I focus on first? I made mistakes, I know that. But kidnapping is... Kidnapping. Bruce interrupted. That's a serious accusation. Did you see anyone get kidnapped? I was across the street watching my wife marry another man. Quite the show, by the way. Roxanne's breathing was ragged, desperate. What do you want? Money? I'll pay whatever you. I want you to understand consequences, Bruce said. For 3 years, you've manipulated and betrayed people with no repercussions. Consider this a learning experience. He hung up and removed the battery from his phone. Phase 2 was ready to begin. Wednesday morning brought new players to the game. Celia Delgado had hired a private security firm to investigate her brother's disappearance. The team was competent, former law enforcement with resources and connections. They'd identified Bruce as a person of interest within 12 hours. Bruce was impressed. Celia was smarter and more determined than her brother. She'd also brought significant financial resources to bear, hiring not just investigators but lawyers, and even reaching out to federal agencies through political connections. She's going to be a problem, Norman observed, watching Celia coordinate with her security team from the lobby of her hotel. She's going to be an opportunity, Bruce corrected. Javier's weakness is emotional manipulation. Celia's weakness is her love for her brother. We can use that. The psychological pressure on Roxanne was working perfectly. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and was making increasingly erratic decisions. She'd fired her private investigator after 24 hours, convinced he was working for Bruce. She tried to access Bruce's military records through unofficial channels, only to trigger security protocols that brought military intelligence investigators to her door. Most importantly, she was starting to crack under the weight of her own guilt. The surveillance feeds showed her talking to herself, reliving conversations with Bruce, and slowly accepting responsibility for the destruction of her life. Thursday evening, Bruce decided it was time for direct contact. He appeared at Roxanne's apartment door at exactly 9 p.m., dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the bearing that had made him a decorated soldier. When Roxanne opened the door, she looked like a ghost of herself. Dark circles ringed her eyes, Her hair was unwashed, and her hands trembled with exhaustion and terror. "Hello, wife," Bruce said pleasantly. She tried to slam the door, but Bruce's boot was already in the frame. He pushed inside with controlled force, backing her into the living room, where he'd once watched movies and planned their future. "I could call the police," Roxanne whispered. "And tell them what?" "That your husband came to visit." Bruce settled into the chair where he used to read her letters from deployment. "Besides, you've called them so many times they're starting to think you're having a breakdown." "Which, incidentally, you are." Roxanne collapsed onto the couch where she'd conceived another man's child. "What do you want from me, Bruce?" "I want you to confess," he said simply. "To everything. The affair, the financial fraud, your previous marriage, your pattern of targeting military families. I want you to understand exactly what kind of person you are. And if I do, you'll let Javier go." Bruce's smile was arctic. "Oh, Roxanne, you still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation. This is Judgment Day." He stood up, his presence filling the room with barely contained violence. "You have 48 hours to think about your confession. After that, we move to Phase 3. As he reached the door, Bruce turned back. "By the way, you should call your doctor. Stress is bad for the baby." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Roxanne alone with her terror and the growing realization that Bruce Mercer was no longer the man she'd married. He was something far more dangerous, a predator who'd been betrayed by his prey and was now hunting with all the skills the military had taught him. Outside, Norman was waiting in their surveillance van. "Phase 3, he asked. "Phase 3, Bruce confirmed. "Time to introduce consequences." Chapter 4, The Unraveling. Friday morning began with Celia Delgado standing in the lobby of the Fayetteville Police Department, her voice cutting through the bureaucratic haze like a blade. At 34, she possessed the kind of focused intensity that came from years of managing artists and navigating the competitive Atlanta gallery scene. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her expensive suit spoke of success and determination. "Detective Morris," she said to the tired-looking investigator assigned to her brother's case, "it's been 5 days. 5 days since my brother was abducted in broad daylight. And you have no leads, no suspects, and apparently no urgency." Detective Larry Lake had worked missing persons for 12 years, but he'd never encountered a case quite like this one. No ransom demands, no body, no witnesses beyond the hysterical wedding guests who'd given conflicting accounts. The bride, Roxanne Mercer, was clearly having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations about her ex-husband while providing no concrete evidence. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration," Lake began, but Celia cut him off. "Do you?" "Because my understanding is that you have a decorated Army Ranger whose wife mysteriously married another man while he was overseas, and that same man disappeared immediately after the ceremony. How is that not your primary lead? We've attempted to contact Sergeant Mercer, but he's not responding to official inquiries. However, we have no evidence that he was even in the state when your brother disappeared." Celia placed a tablet on Lake's desk, displaying financial records and travel information her private investigators had compiled. "Bruce Mercer flew into Fayetteville last Tuesday. He rented a car under his own name. He's been staying at the Comfort Inn on Skibbo Road. Your department hasn't even requested his hotel records." Detective Lake studied the information, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach that came with realizing he'd been outpaced by civilian investigators. "We'll follow up on this immediately." "You'd better," Celia said, "because if the police can't protect citizens from vigilante soldiers, I'll find someone who can." 3 blocks away, Bruce was watching the police station through high-powered binoculars from the roof of a parking garage. He'd anticipated Celia's move and had prepared accordingly. The evidence trail she'd discovered was intentionally obvious, designed to draw official attention while revealing nothing useful. His phone buzzed with a text from Norman. "Package delivered." Bruce smiled. Phase 3 was beginning. At her apartment, Roxanne was staring at the latest delivery, a manila envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the night. Inside were copies of her medical records from 3 different hospitals, spanning the past 5 years. Her hands shook as she recognized what she was looking at. The records told a story she'd tried to bury. Her first husband, Eddie Eldridge hadn't died in a training accident. He died of poisoning, slow, methodical, untraceable until after his death. The insurance investigation had been inconclusive, but the medical evidence was damning. Someone with access to his food and medication had been gradually introducing toxins into his system. Attached to the medical records was a note in Bruce's handwriting. Interesting reading. I wonder what the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division would make of this. Or better yet, what would Javier think if he knew he was carrying the baby of a murderer? Roxanne's knees buckled. She'd been so careful with Eddie's death, so methodical in her planning. The toxins were industrial chemicals, easily acquired and nearly impossible to detect without specifically testing for them. She played the grieving widow perfectly, collecting life insurance and survivor benefits while planning her next move. But Bruce had found the truth, just as he'd found everything else she'd tried to hide. Her phone rang. It was Celia Delgado. Mrs. Mercer? This is Celia, Javier's sister. I think we need to talk. They met at a coffee shop downtown, two women bound together by Bruce's campaign of psychological warfare. Celia was composed and professional, but Roxanne could see the steel beneath her polished exterior. I've been investigating your husband, Celia said without preamble. The police are useless, but I have resources they don't. Bruce Mercer is here, and he's responsible for my brother's disappearance. Roxanne wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth against the cold that had settled into her bones. I know. What exactly happened between you two? And don't lie to me. I've already uncovered most of your history. For the first time in 5 days, Roxanne felt a spark of hope. Celia was intelligent, determined, and wealthy enough to fight Bruce on equal terms. Perhaps together, they could find a way out of this nightmare. Bruce and I were married for 3 years, Roxanne began carefully. He was deployed most of that time. I made some mistakes. You had an affair with my brother while your husband was in a combat zone, Celia said flatly. You got pregnant, divorced your husband, and married Javier. That's not a mistake. That's a calculated betrayal. Roxanne flinched, but continued. Bruce came back changed. Dangerous. He's not the man I married. He's become something else. Celia leaned forward. What kind of training did he have in the Army? Reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, psychological operations. Roxanne's voice dropped to a whisper. He knows how to break people. And that's what he's doing to you. That's what he's doing to all of us, Roxanne corrected. Bruce doesn't forgive, and he never forgets. He's going to destroy everyone who betrayed him, and he's going to enjoy doing it. Celia absorbed this information, her analytical mind working through the implications. You're afraid of him. I'm terrified of him. You should be too. That evening, Celia returned to her hotel to find a surprise waiting in her room. Despite the enhanced security she'd hired, someone had entered without triggering any alarms. On her bed was a photograph of Javier, more recent than the one from his wedding. He was seated in what appeared to be a comfortable chair, reading a book. He looked unharmed but tired, stressed. On the table beside him were fresh fruit, bottled water, and what appeared to be takeout containers from local restaurants. On the back of the photograph was a message. Your brother is safe and well-fed. His accommodations are comfortable, and he has books to read. This can continue indefinitely, or we can move to more permanent arrangements. The choice depends on his sister's actions. Below there was an address and a time, midnight. Celia stared at the photograph, her gallery owners noting the quality of lighting and composition. Whoever had taken this was skilled, but they'd also left clues, reflections in the window, shadows that indicated direction, subtle details that could be analyzed. She called her security team, but even as they responded to her hotel room, Celia was making preparations for the midnight meeting. She was done being reactive. It was time to take the offensive. At 11:30 p.m., Celia arrived at the specified address, an abandoned textile warehouse on the outskirts of town. Her security team was positioned around the perimeter, and she wore a wire that would record everything for evidence. Bruce emerged from the shadows at exactly midnight, dressed in black tactical clothing that made him nearly invisible in the darkness. He moved with the fluid precision of a predator, and Celia understood immediately why Roxanne was terrified of him. "Ms. Delgado," Bruce said politely, "thank you for coming. Where is my brother?" "Safe, comfortable, bored out of his mind, but physically unharmed." Bruce stepped into a pool of light from a security lamp, allowing her to see his face clearly. "You've been conducting your own investigation. I'm impressed. I want to see him." "Of course you do. And you will, under the right circumstances." Bruce's expression was calm, almost friendly. "But first, we need to discuss your brother's future." Celia's hand moved to the recorder hidden in her jacket. "What do you want?" "I want justice," Bruce said simply. "Your brother destroyed my marriage and stole my wife. That requires consequences." "He didn't steal anything. Roxanne made her own choices." "Agreed. And she's facing her own consequences." But Javier participated willingly in the betrayal. He knew she was married to a deployed soldier, and he pursued her anyway. That makes him complicit. Bruce pulled out a tablet and showed Celia a video file. On the screen, Javier was sitting in a comfortable room, eating a meal and reading a magazine. He looked tired but unharmed. "Your brother is a weak man," Bruce continued. "He survives by charming women and living off their resources. He's a parasite, and like all parasites, he's adapted to avoid consequences. But adaptation only works until you encounter a natural predator." Celia studied Bruce's face, noting the complete absence of emotion. This wasn't anger or revenge. This was something colder, more calculating. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Bruce smiled, and for the first time, Celia understood why Roxanne was having a breakdown. "I want you to choose," he said. Chapter 5. The Price of Loyalty. Celia's blood ran cold as Bruce's words hung in the night air. The abandoned warehouse around them felt like a theater stage, and she was being forced into a role she'd never auditioned for. "Choose what?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Bruce activated the tablet again, revealing a split screen. On one side, Javier sat in his comfortable prison, unaware he was being watched. On the other side was live footage of a woman Celia didn't recognize, middle-aged Hispanic, working the night shift at what appeared to be a medical facility. "That's Dr. Margarita Lowe," Bruce explained with clinical precision. "She works at Atlanta General Hospital, where she's been embezzling medications for the past 18 months. Specifically, she's been stealing morphine and selling it to dealers who've been responsible for 7 overdose deaths in the past year." Celia's trained eye caught the timestamp on the surveillance footage. It was happening now, in real time. "What does this have to do with my brother?" "Dr. Lowe is your brother's supplier," Bruce continued. "Not for drugs, for something far more valuable. She's been providing him with prescription medications that he's been using to photograph his subjects in compromising positions. Rohypnol, specifically." The words hit Celia like a physical blow. "You're lying." Bruce swiped to another screen, showing dozens of photographs. Young women at gallery openings, art shows, and private sessions, all with a glazed, unfocused look of chemical incapacitation. In each photo, Javier's watermark was visible in the corner. "Your brother isn't just a photographer," Bruce said. "He's a predator. He's been drugging women and photographing them for years, building a collection of compromising images that he uses for blackmail and sexual leverage." Celia's knees nearly buckled. She defended galleries that featured edgy photography, had argued for artistic freedom even when the content was controversial. But this was different. This was predation disguised as art. "The women in these photographs," Bruce continued, "include the daughters of 3 prominent Atlanta businessmen, 2 local politicians, and a federal judge. Your brother has been extorting money and favors from their families for over 3 years." The tablet showed financial records, bank transfers, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. Javier hadn't just been surviving as a struggling artist. He'd been running a sophisticated blackmail operation. "Now," Bruce said, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher, "you have a choice to make. You can continue defending your brother, knowing what kind of man he truly is. Or you can walk away and let justice take its course." Celia's mind raced through the implications. If this evidence was accurate, and Bruce's previous intelligence had been flawlessly correct, then Javier wasn't the victim she'd believed him to be. He was a predator who'd spent years perfecting his techniques. Even if this is true, she said finally, you can't just take the law into your own hands. Can't I? Bruce asked. Your brother drugged and photographed the daughter of federal judge Isaac Lyons last month. She was 17 years old. Do you think Judge Lyons would prefer to handle this through official channels, or would he appreciate a more direct approach? The threat was clear. Bruce wasn't just holding Javier. He was holding evidence that could destroy dozens of powerful families unless it was handled quietly. What exactly are you proposing? Celia asked. Bruce switched the tablet to a new screen showing a legal document. Your brother signs a full confession to everything. The drugging, the photography, the blackmail. In exchange, he disappears. New identity, new life, somewhere far from anyone he's hurt. He never contacts you again, never returns to the United States, and never practices photography professionally. And if I refuse, then the evidence goes public. Every family he's blackmailed gets copies of his entire collection. The FBI gets detailed records of his drug purchases and financial transactions. And your brother faces federal charges for sexual exploitation of minors, interstate commerce in illegal substances, and federal extortion. Celia realized she was holding her breath. What about Roxanne? What happens to her? Bruce's expression didn't change. Roxanne has her own choices to make. But unlike your brother, her crimes are more personal. She betrayed me specifically, personally, with malice and premeditation. That requires a different kind of justice. You're going to kill her. I'm going to give her exactly what she gave me, Bruce corrected. Complete betrayal by someone she trusts, followed by the systematic destruction of everything she thinks she knows about herself. The recording device in Celia's jacket felt heavier than lead. Everything Bruce was saying would be evidence of conspiracy, kidnapping, and premeditated assault. But it would also be evidence of crimes her brother had committed that were far worse than anything she'd imagined. I need time to think, she said. Of course. Bruce handed her a burner phone. You have until tomorrow at midnight. Call that number with your decision. But understand, this offer expires once, and it doesn't get renewed. Bruce melted back into the shadows, leaving Celia alone in the warehouse. Her security team rushed to her position, but by the time they reached her, Bruce was gone. Back at her hotel, Celia dismissed her security team and sat in darkness, staring at the evidence on Bruce's tablet. She'd spent her adult life supporting artists, believing in creative expression and the complexity of human nature. But the photographs on that screen weren't art. They were documentation of assault. She called her own private investigator, a former FBI agent named Omar McCormick, who specialized in background verification for high-stakes gallery purchases. Omar, I need you to verify some information for me, she said when he answered. It's about my brother. Celia, it's 2 a.m. What kind of information? The kind that could destroy both our careers if it's true. 6 hours later, Omar called back with confirmation that made Celia's stomach turn. Not only was Bruce's evidence accurate, but Omar had uncovered additional victims, women who'd been too scared or too compromised to report what had happened to them. Celia, Omar said carefully, I've known you for 8 years. You're one of the most ethical people I've ever worked with. But your brother, he's not who you think he is. Celia made her decision. At 11:45 p.m. the following night, she dialed the number Bruce had given her. I accept your terms, she said when he answered. But I have conditions of my own. I'm listening. The women he photographed, they get copies of everything he has. Every image, every document, every piece of evidence they need to protect themselves. And they get financial compensation from his assets. Agreed. And I want to see him one last time. To say goodbye. There was a pause. That could be arranged. But understand, after tonight, your brother ceases to exist. Celia Delgado will have no family named Javier, no brother who was a photographer, no connection to any of this. I understand. An hour later, Celia stood in a warehouse across town, watching as Javier signed documents that would erase his existence and confess to crimes that would haunt his victims' families forever. When he looked up at her with confused, pleading eyes, Celia felt her heart break and hardened simultaneously. "I loved you," she told him. "But I loved who I thought you were, not who you actually are." She turned and walked away, never looking back. Behind her, Bruce began making arrangements for Javier's new life, if it could be called a life at all. Chapter 6. The Mirror's Edge. By Sunday morning, Roxanne had stopped pretending she was in control. The medical records about Eddie's death lay scattered across her kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom, and she'd finally accepted that Bruce had been planning this revenge for longer than she'd realized. The morning brought a new horror, a knock at her door at exactly 7 a.m. When Roxanne peered through the peephole, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Middle-aged, professional, carrying a briefcase that screamed federal authority. "Mrs. Mercer? I'm Agent Beth Lutz with the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division. I'd like to ask you some questions about your first husband, Eddie Eldridge." Roxanne's hand shook as she unlocked the door. Agent Lutz was exactly what Bruce had warned her about, the long arm of military justice, reaching across time to drag her past into the light. "May I come in?" Lutz asked, though it wasn't really a question. Agent Lutz settled into the same chair where Bruce had sat 3 days earlier, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of the apartment. She opened her briefcase and removed a file thick enough to represent months of investigation. "We reopened the investigation into Sergeant Eldridge's death," Lutz began. "New evidence has come to light suggesting his death wasn't accidental." Roxanne felt the walls closing in. "I don't understand. Eddie died in a training accident. That was the official finding." "The official finding was inconclusive," Lutz corrected. "But recent analysis of preserved tissue samples shows evidence of systematic poisoning. Industrial solvents introduced into his system over a period of several months." The agent opened the file, revealing photographs of chemical analysis reports, medical examination findings, and witness statements that painted a picture of methodical murder. Eddie's symptoms began approximately 6 months before his death, Lutz continued. Fatigue, memory problems, digestive issues, all consistent with chronic toxin exposure. His medical records show he sought treatment multiple times, but the symptoms were attributed to stress and overwork. Roxanne's mouth felt full of cotton. "What does this have to do with me?" Agent Lutz smiled without warmth. "You had exclusive access to Eddie's food and medication. You were the primary beneficiary of his life insurance policy. And most interestingly, you moved across the country and remarried within 8 months of his death. Lots of military widows remarry quickly," Roxanne said desperately. "It's hard to be alone." "True, but most military widows don't have advanced chemistry degrees." Lutz produced another document, Roxanne's college transcripts, showing a bachelor's degree in biochemistry with a focus on industrial applications. Roxanne felt her carefully constructed world crumbling. She'd buried her chemistry background so deep that even Bruce hadn't known about it during their marriage. But somehow, he'd uncovered everything. "I want a lawyer," Roxanne whispered. "Of course. But I should mention, we've also received some interesting information about your current husband, Bruce Mercer. Specifically, allegations that he may be involved in the recent disappearance of Javier Irvin." Agent Lutz produced another file, this one containing surveillance photos of Bruce, detailed timelines of his movements, and witness statements from the wedding guests. "It seems you have a pattern, Mrs. Mercer. Your husbands have a tendency to encounter violence around the time you decide you no longer need them." The implication was clear. Agent Lutz believed Roxanne was responsible for both Eddie's death and Bruce's apparent violent turn. She was being painted as a black widow who drove good men to destruction. "Bruce is alive," Roxanne said frantically. "He's the one doing this. He's trying to frame me for what? For the death of your first husband? We have evidence, Mrs. Mercer. Medical records, financial documents, chemical analysis. What we don't have is Bruce Mercer's location or any evidence that he was involved in Mr. Irvin's disappearance." Agent Lutz stood up, her mission accomplished. "You should get that lawyer. And you should think very carefully about whether you want to cooperate with this investigation or face federal charges for the murder of a United States Marine." After Lutz left, Roxanne sat in stunned silence. Bruce had orchestrated this perfectly, the timing, the evidence, the narrative. He positioned himself as the grieving husband whose wife had driven him to vigilante justice, while painting her as a serial killer who specialized in military men. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Enjoying your visit from Agent Lutz? This is what consequences look like. You have 24 hours to make your confession. After that, the next visitor will be a homicide detective with an arrest warrant." Roxanne threw the phone across the room, but it immediately buzzed again with a second message. "P.S. Agent Lutz isn't really MCID. She's an actress I hired. But the evidence is real, and the real agents will be here tomorrow if you don't confess tonight." The realization hit Roxanne like a physical blow. Bruce had staged the entire encounter, complete with fake credentials and manufactured evidence. But the underlying facts were real. He'd somehow discovered her chemistry background, connected it to Eddie's death, and built a case that would destroy her. That evening, Roxanne made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. She drove to the police station and asked to speak with Detective Lake about her husband's disappearance. "Mrs. Mercer," Lake said when she was shown into his office, "I was hoping you'd come in. We have some questions about your husband's whereabouts." "I know where he is," Roxanne said, "and I know what he's doing. But I need protection before I tell you anything." Lake leaned forward. "Protection from what?" "From Bruce. He's not the man everyone thinks he is. He's dangerous, and he's been planning this revenge for months. Maybe years." For the next 3 hours, Roxanne told Detective Lake everything. The affair, the pregnancy, the systematic campaign of psychological warfare, and Bruce's threats about Eddie's death. She held nothing back, confessing to adultery, financial fraud, and emotional manipulation. But when Lake asked about Eddie Eldridge, Roxanne made a choice that surprised even herself. "Eddie's death was my fault," she said quietly. "Not because I killed him, but because I didn't love him enough to be faithful. I was already looking for someone else when he died. Bruce discovered that, and he's using it to make me look like a murderer." Detective Lake studied her carefully. "Are you saying you didn't poison your first husband?" "I'm saying Bruce is a master manipulator who knows how to make guilty people look like monsters. I'm guilty of being a terrible wife, but I'm not a killer." Lake closed his notebook. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm going to be honest with you. We've investigated hundreds of missing persons cases, and this one is unusual. Your husband is clearly involved, but he's been very careful not to leave evidence. And your story, it's consistent, but it's also exactly what someone would say if they were trying to deflect blame." Roxanne felt her last hope slipping away. "You don't believe me. I believe you're scared. I believe your husband is angry. But I also believe there's a lot more to this story than either of you is telling me." As Roxanne left the police station, she realized that Bruce had won this round too. He'd forced her to confess to crimes that made her look guilty while positioning himself as the wronged husband seeking justice. Her phone buzzed with one final message: "Confession accepted." Phase 4 begins now. Roxanne looked around the parking lot, suddenly aware that she was completely alone and utterly defenseless against whatever Bruce had planned next. In the shadows between streetlights, she thought she saw a familiar figure watching her. But when she looked again, there was nothing there except the growing certainty that her nightmare was just beginning. Chapter 7: The Hunter's Moon. Wednesday morning brought the kind of news that changes everything. Detective Lake found Javier Irvin's body in a drainage culvert 15 miles outside Fayetteville, posed as if he'd crawled there to die. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated death by exposure and dehydration, but the scene told a different story. Javier had been released somewhere in the wilderness and forced to find his way back to civilization without food, water, or proper clothing. The journey had taken him through swampland, dense forest, and industrial areas where homeless camps and drug dealers made survival even more dangerous. He'd almost made it. GPS data from his phone, found clutched in his dead hand, showed he'd walked nearly 30 miles over 5 days, following drainage ditches and abandoned railway lines toward the lights of the city. He died less than 2 miles from a major highway. Bruce had given him a chance to survive, but only a chance. No guarantees, no safety net, just the same brutal mathematics of natural selection that governed every battlefield Bruce had ever fought on. The discovery triggered a massive police response. Detective Lake coordinated with federal agencies, military police, and the state crime lab to process what was now officially a homicide scene. The timing was perfect. Bruce had orchestrated Javier's death to occur just as Roxanne's psychological breakdown reached its peak. Celia Delgado flew back from Atlanta to identify the body and arrange funeral services. She met with Detective Lake privately, providing him with the evidence Bruce had shown her about Javier's criminal activities. "I need to ask you directly, Ms. Delgado," Lake said after reviewing the files. "Did you know about your brother's extracurricular activities?" Celia's composure never wavered. "I suspected Javier was involved with questionable people, but I had no idea about the scope of his crimes. When I learned the truth, I made the decision to protect his victims rather than shield him from consequences." "And you believe Bruce Mercer was responsible for his death?" "I believe Bruce Mercer is a predator who used my brother's crimes as justification for murder. But I also believe my brother victimized women who deserve justice. The world is complicated, detective. Sometimes monsters destroy other monsters." Lake studied Celia's file on Javier, noting the meticulous documentation and legal analysis. "You put a lot of work into investigating your own brother. I put a lot of work into learning the truth. What I did with that truth was my choice to make." That afternoon, the investigative net tightened around Bruce. His hotel records showed he'd checked out the day before Javier's estimated time of death. Security cameras captured him leaving the city, driving a rental vehicle that was later found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Raleigh. But the physical evidence told a frustrating story. Bruce had been careful. No fingerprints on the abandoned vehicle, no DNA evidence at the scene, no witnesses who could place him with Javier during the critical time frame. He'd moved through the investigation like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Norman Bradshaw was brought in for questioning, but his alibi was ironclad. He'd been on base for 3 consecutive days, attending mandatory training sessions and sleeping in the barracks. Security cameras and witness statements confirmed his presence at times that made it impossible for him to participate in Javier's death. "Your friend Bruce," Detective Lake said during Norman's interview. "Where do you think he might go?" Norman's expression was unreadable. "Bruce is the best soldier I've ever served with. If he doesn't want to be found, you won't find him. But if you're looking for him, you should ask yourself why. A man is dead. A lot of men are dead," Norman replied. "Some of them deserved it. Some of them didn't. Bruce knows the difference." Lake leaned forward. "Are you saying Javier Irvin deserved to die?" "I'm saying if Bruce killed him, he had a reason. Bruce doesn't waste ammunition on targets that don't matter." While the police investigation intensified, Roxanne was falling apart in real time. The discovery of Javier's body confirmed her worst fears about Bruce's capabilities, but it also triggered a wave of guilt that surprised her with its intensity. She'd never loved Javier. He'd been an escape from the reality of military life, a validation of her attractiveness, a rebellion against Bruce's absence. But she'd also been carrying his child, and now their baby would grow up knowing its father had died because of choices Roxanne had made. The media attention was merciless. Local news crews camped outside her apartment, broadcasting live updates about the military love triangle murder. Social media exploded with speculation, amateur detective work, and judgmental commentary about military wives who betrayed their deployed husbands. Roxanne found herself cast as the villain in a story that painted Bruce as the wronged hero driven to vigilante justice. The narrative was compelling and simple. Loyal soldier discovers wife's betrayal, snaps under pressure, delivers frontier justice to the homewrecker. But Roxanne knew Bruce better than the media did. This wasn't a crime of passion or a psychological break. This was a carefully planned campaign of destruction, and Javier's death was just the opening move. Thursday evening, Bruce made his next appearance. Roxanne was leaving her lawyer's office. She'd finally hired representation, though she suspected it was too late, when Bruce fell in a step beside her on the sidewalk. He was dressed casually, wearing sunglasses despite the evening light, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man taking a pleasant walk. "Hello, Roxanne." She stopped walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. "People can see us." "I certainly hope so," Bruce said pleasantly. "I'm a concerned husband checking on my pregnant wife during a difficult time." Very appropriate behavior. Roxanne looked around desperately. The street was busy with evening foot traffic, but no one was paying attention to their conversation. Bruce had chosen the location perfectly, public enough to provide witnesses, private enough to avoid eavesdropping. "You killed him," she whispered. "I gave him a chance to survive," Bruce corrected. "Better odds than he gave his victims." Javier was weak, physically and mentally. He made poor choices under pressure. Natural selection. He was going to be the father of my child. Bruce's expression didn't change. "No, he wasn't. That child will never know its father existed. You're going to raise it alone, wondering every day whether I'm watching, whether I'm planning something, whether its father's crimes will surface and destroy your carefully rebuilt life." Roxanne felt tears starting. "What do you want from me, Bruce?" "I want you to understand consequences," he said, echoing their earlier conversation. "For 3 years, you manipulated people without thinking about the price they'd pay. Now you're paying that price yourself." Bruce handed her a manila envelope. Inside are the real medical records from Eddie Eldridge's death. The actual autopsy results, not the forgeries I showed you earlier. Eddie died in a training accident, exactly as originally reported. He wasn't poisoned. Roxanne stared at the envelope, not understanding. "I made you confess to a murder you didn't commit," Bruce continued. "I convinced you that you were a killer, made you believe you were capable of murdering someone you'd promised to love. How's it feel to have someone rewrite your history? To have your own memories questioned?" The psychological manipulation was so complete, so devastating, that Roxanne nearly collapsed on the sidewalk. Bruce had convinced her she was a murderer by presenting fake evidence and exploiting her guilt about being an unfaithful wife. "The chemistry degree was real," Bruce said. "The timeline was real. Your financial motives were real. The only thing I fabricated was Eddie's cause of death. But you believed it completely because you knew you were capable of betrayal. I just convinced you that betrayal could escalate to murder." Roxanne understood now why Bruce was considered so dangerous in psychological operations. He didn't break people with torture or violence. He broke them by forcing them to confront the worst possibilities about themselves. "This is what you did to me," Bruce said quietly. "You made me question everything I believed about love, loyalty, and trust. You convinced me that 3 years of marriage was a lie, that everything I thought I knew about you was manipulation. Now you know how that feels." Bruce started to walk away, then turned back for one final comment. "Phase 5 begins tomorrow," he said. "I suggest you use tonight to say goodbye to the person you used to be." As Bruce disappeared into the evening crowd, Roxanne opened the envelope with shaking hands. The real autopsy report confirmed everything he'd said. Eddie had died in a legitimate training accident, killed by equipment failure and human error. She confessed to a murder that never happened, convinced herself she was capable of killing someone she'd actually cared about, and spent 4 days believing she was a sociopathic predator. But the most terrifying realization was still to come. If Bruce could manipulate her this completely about the past, what was he planning to make her believe about the future? Chapter 8. The Perfect Storm. Friday morning brought chaos disguised as justice. Federal agents surrounded Roxanne's apartment building at 6 a.m., their black SUVs and tactical gear transforming the quiet residential street into a war zone. Detective Lake supervised the operation, but his expression suggested he was as surprised by the timing as everyone else. The warrant was comprehensive: financial records, computer equipment, personal documents, and anything related to either of Roxanne's marriages. The agents moved through her life with methodical precision, cataloging evidence of a conspiracy that was becoming larger and more complex by the hour. Agent Beth Lutz, the real one this time, led the financial investigation team. Her preliminary analysis revealed a pattern of behavior that painted Roxanne as a sophisticated predator who specialized in military targets. Mrs. Mercer, Agent Lutz said as Roxanne watched her life being packed into evidence boxes. "We have documentation showing that you've been in contact with 6 different military wives over the past 2 years, providing advice on divorce procedures and asset protection strategies." Roxanne's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Louise Wyatt, immediately intervened. "My client has the right to maintain friendships and offer emotional support to other military spouses." Emotional support? Agent Lutz produced a file thick with printed emails and text messages. Or coaching them on how to extract maximum financial benefit from divorce proceedings while their husbands are deployed? The evidence was damning. Roxanne had indeed been corresponding with other military wives, sharing strategies for asset protection, recommending lawyers who specialized in military divorce, and providing detailed advice on timing separations to maximize financial advantages. What had started as informal support among military spouses had evolved into something that looked suspiciously like a conspiracy to defraud deployed servicemen. The pattern was clear. Identify unhappy military wives, provide them with sophisticated legal and financial advice, then help them execute divorce strategies designed to maximize their financial outcomes. "We're calling it the Dependent Network," Agent Lutz explained to Detective Lake privately. "Roxanne Mercer appears to be at the center of a group that's been systematically exploiting military divorce laws and deployment cycles." Lake reviewed the evidence, noting the careful documentation and strategic thinking involved. "How much money are we talking about?" Conservative estimate: $3.7 million in fraudulent asset transfers over 18 months. Alimony, child support, and property settlements that were negotiated using inside information and coordinated legal strategies. But as the federal investigation expanded, something unexpected emerged. The deeper agents dug into the Dependent Network, the more evidence they found of Bruce's involvement. Computer forensics revealed that many of the strategic documents had been created on devices that traced back to IP addresses Bruce had accessed during his deployments. The sophisticated legal advice hadn't come from Roxanne. It had come from Bruce himself, working through encrypted communications and anonymous file sharing services. "Son of a bitch," Detective Lake muttered as the pattern became clear. "He's been running both sides of this operation." Agent Lutz spread the evidence across her temporary command center, revealing the scope of Bruce's psychological warfare campaign. Bruce Mercer has been feeding his wife information and legal strategies, helping her build a network of military wives planning to divorce their deployed husbands. Why would he do that? Because it gave him everything he needed to destroy her completely when the time was right. He's been documenting her activities, recording her conversations, and building a federal case against her while simultaneously enabling her crimes. The realization was staggering. Bruce hadn't just discovered Roxanne's betrayal. He'd been orchestrating it for years, feeding her information and opportunities that would eventually be used to destroy her. Every piece of advice she'd given other wives, every strategy she'd recommended, every dollar that had been fraudulently transferred could be traced back to Bruce's careful manipulation. Detective Lake contacted the military prosecutor's office, realizing that this case had implications far beyond a simple love triangle murder. "We're looking at systematic fraud, conspiracy charges, and potential espionage violations. This guy has been running a long-term intelligence operation against his own wife." Meanwhile, Roxanne was being processed through the federal detention system, facing charges that could result in decades in prison. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being destroyed by the very network she'd helped build, the same illegal activities Bruce had encouraged her to pursue. Her lawyer was brutally honest during their consultation at the detention center. "Roxanne, they have you cold. Financial documents, recorded conversations, email chains that establish conspiracy and intent. You're looking at 25 to 30 years unless you cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" "I did everything they're accusing me of." "You did everything Bruce Mercer convinced you to do?" Louise corrected. "The question is whether you were a willing conspirator or a manipulated victim." That afternoon, Celia Delgado requested a private meeting with Detective Lake. She arrived at the police station carrying a briefcase that contained the final pieces of Bruce's puzzle. "Detective, I need to show you something," she said, producing a recording device. This is from my last conversation with Bruce Mercer before my brother's death. The recording was devastating. Bruce's voice was clear and calm as he explained his long-term strategy, his psychological manipulation techniques, and his ultimate goals for revenge. But the most damning revelation was his admission that he'd been planning Roxanne's destruction since the early days of their marriage. "I knew what kind of person she was within 6 months," Bruce's voice said through the speakers. "I just gave her opportunities to prove it. Every crime she committed, every law she broke, every person she betrayed, I enabled all of it. I fed her information, provided her with resources, and documented everything for future use." Detective Lake stopped the recording. He admits to conspiracy and accessory charges. "There's more," Celia said, advancing the recording. Bruce's voice continued. "The federal charges will destroy her completely. 30 years in prison, forfeiture of all assets, supervised probation for the rest of her life. She'll lose everything. Her freedom, her child, her identity. And the best part is that she'll know I orchestrated every minute of it." The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing Bruce's psychological profile of Roxanne, his manipulation techniques, and his step-by-step plan for her complete destruction. It was a masterclass in long-term psychological warfare, executed with the precision and patience of a professional intelligence operative. "Why are you giving me this?" Lake asked when the recording ended. Celia's expression was haunted. "Because what Bruce did to my brother was justice. Javier was a predator who victimized innocent women. But what he's doing to Roxanne, that's something else. That's the kind of psychological torture that destroys souls. You think Roxanne is innocent. I think Roxanne is guilty of being weak, stupid, and selfish. But Bruce is guilty of being a monster who manipulates people into becoming the worst versions of themselves, then punishes them for his own handiwork." Detective Lake realized he was dealing with something unprecedented, a revenge plot so sophisticated that had taken years to execute and involved federal crimes on multiple levels. Bruce hadn't just killed Javier and framed Roxanne. He'd systematically destroyed her life by enabling her to destroy herself. As federal agents expanded their investigation into the dependent network, they began discovering the true scope of Bruce's psychological warfare campaign. He'd been manipulating military wives across multiple states, feeding them information and resources that enabled them to commit federal crimes, then documenting everything for future use. The pattern was always the same. Identify a potential target, gain their trust, provide them with opportunities for criminal behavior, document their activities, then leverage the evidence for whatever purpose suited his needs. Roxanne had been his primary target, but she wasn't his only victim. Bruce had been running a systematic campaign against military families, using their vulnerabilities and domestic problems as weapons in a larger war only he understood. Saturday evening, as the investigation reached its peak intensity, Bruce made one final phone call to Detective Lake. "Detective, this is Bruce Mercer. I believe you have some questions for me." "Mr. Mercer, where are you?" "I'm exactly where I've always been, 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But I think it's time we had a conversation about consequences." Lake gestured frantically for technicians to trace the call. "Mr. Mercer, you need to turn yourself in." Bruce's laugh was cold as Arctic wind. "Turn myself in for what? For proving that my wife was a criminal? For documenting her crimes and providing that evidence to federal authorities? For allowing Javier Irvin to face the consequences of his own choices in the wilderness? You killed Javier Irvin. I gave Javier Irvin the same chance for survival he gave his victims. None. But I didn't kill him, Detective. Nature did. Weakness did. Poor decision-making did. I just provided the circumstances where his character could be tested." Lake realized that Bruce was carefully avoiding any direct admission of murder while simultaneously confessing to everything else. "What about your wife? What about the conspiracy charges? What about them? Roxanne committed federal crimes for years, and I documented those crimes. The evidence you have is real, Detective. Every transaction, every conversation, every fraudulent asset transfer actually happened. I didn't frame her. I just made sure there was proof." The call ended abruptly, leaving Detective Lake with the disturbing realization that Bruce might never face charges for any of his crimes. He'd been too careful, too clever, and too patient to leave evidence that would support criminal prosecution. But as the weekend progressed, federal agents made a discovery that changed everything. Bruce's real target hadn't been Javier or Roxanne. It had been the entire military justice system itself. Chapter 9: The Final Gambit. Sunday morning brought a revelation that made every federal agent involved in the case question everything they thought they understood about Bruce Mercer. Hidden in the deepest layers of Roxanne's computer files, forensic specialists discovered a cache of encrypted documents that detailed something far more ambitious than personal revenge. Agent Beth Lutz called an emergency briefing at 6 a.m., assembling every law enforcement agency involved in the investigation. The conference room was packed with federal agents, military police, and local detectives, all staring at a projection screen that displayed the most sophisticated intelligence operation any of them had ever seen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Lutz began, "we've been looking at this case backwards. Bruce Mercer wasn't seeking revenge against his wife. He was conducting a systematic investigation into military family fraud, using his wife as an unwitting asset to penetrate and document a massive criminal conspiracy. The evidence was staggering. For 4 years, Bruce had been identifying and documenting a network of military wives, civilian lawyers, and even some military personnel who had been systematically defrauding the Department of Defense through coordinated divorce schemes, false dependency claims, and fraudulent benefit applications. The dependent network wasn't Roxanne's creation. It was a pre-existing criminal organization that Bruce had infiltrated by encouraging his wife to become involved. Every piece of advice Roxanne had given other wives had been carefully crafted by Bruce to expose additional layers of the conspiracy. The total fraud amount, Agent Lutz continued, is currently estimated at $47 million over 8 years. This network has been stealing from military families and taxpayers on an industrial scale. Detective Lake studied the organizational charts and financial flow diagrams that covered every wall of the conference room. How many people are we talking about? 237 active participants across 15 states. Lawyers, accountants, military personnel, and family members. They've been running coordinated schemes that exploit deployment cycles, emergency custody laws, and military benefit systems. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Agent Lutz activated a new presentation that showed Bruce's true role in the investigation. Bruce Mercer has been working undercover for military intelligence for the past 5 years, she announced. This entire operation, including his marriage to Roxanne, was part of a deep cover investigation into military family fraud. The room erupted in stunned silence. Every agent present had been chasing a man they believed to be a rogue soldier seeking personal revenge, only to discover he was actually conducting an authorized intelligence operation. The psychological pressure he placed on his wife, the documentation of her criminal activities, even the staging of Javier Irvin's death, all of it was designed to force the criminal network into the open where it could be documented and prosecuted. Detective Lake felt his understanding of the case completely reorganize itself. Javier Irvin is still alive. Javier Irvin is in federal protective custody, providing detailed testimony about the blackmail and extortion network he was operating. His death was staged to create urgency and force other network participants to communicate in ways that could be monitored and recorded. Agent Lutz displayed surveillance photos showing Javier alive and well in a federal safe house, cooperating with investigators as part of a plea agreement that would send him to prison for 15 years instead of life. The psychological warfare Bruce conducted against his wife wasn't personal revenge. It was designed to break her psychologically, so she would provide complete cooperation with federal investigators. Every pressure point he applied was calculated to force her to reveal information about the larger conspiracy. The scope of Bruce's operation was breathtaking. He'd spent 5 years building a false identity as a devoted husband, gaining his wife's trust, and encouraging her to become deeply involved in criminal activities that would eventually expose an entire criminal network. "Where is Bruce now?" Lake asked. "Langley, Virginia. He's been debriefing with military intelligence and preparing for the prosecution phase of this operation. He'll be testifying before a grand jury next week." Monday morning, Roxanne was transferred from federal detention to a secure conference room where she was finally told the truth about her husband and her marriage. Agent Lutz conducted the debriefing personally, accompanied by military prosecutors and federal defenders who would be handling her case. "Mrs. Mercer," Agent Lutz began, "I need to explain some things about your husband that you don't understand." Roxanne looked exhausted, broken by 4 days of federal detention and the psychological pressure of facing 30 years in prison. "What's left to understand? Bruce destroyed my life because I cheated on him." "Bruce destroyed your life because you were participating in a criminal conspiracy that was stealing from military families and taxpayers. The affair with Javier Irvin was just the trigger he used to initiate the final phase of his investigation." Agent Lutz spent the next 2 hours walking Roxanne through the evidence of her own crimes, the scope of the dependent network, and Bruce's role as an undercover intelligence operative. The financial documents, recorded conversations, and email chains painted a picture of systematic fraud that had been going on for years. Every piece of advice he gave other wives came from Bruce, Agent Lutz explained. He was feeding you information specifically designed to help you document and expand the criminal network. You were an intelligence asset, not a wife. Roxanne's world collapsed completely as she understood the scope of her manipulation. Her marriage had been a professional assignment. Her husband's love had been a performance designed to gain her trust and exploit her weaknesses. Even their intimate moments had been calculated to advance his intelligence objectives. The affairs you had before Bruce, with other military men, those were documented too. Bruce identified you as a potential asset because of your pattern of targeting military personnel for financial gain. You were recruited because you were already a criminal. The psychological destruction was complete. Roxanne realized that nothing about her adult life had been real. Every relationship, every emotion, every decision had been manipulated by intelligence operatives who saw her as a tool to be used and discarded. "What happens to me now?" she whispered. "That depends on your level of cooperation," Agent Lutz replied. "You can testify against the other network participants and serve 8 to 12 years in federal prison, or you can maintain your innocence and serve 25 to 30 years. Tuesday afternoon, Bruce Mercer appeared before a federal grand jury to present the evidence he'd been gathering for 5 years. He was dressed in his military uniform, decorated with ribbons and medals that reflected years of distinguished service in multiple combat zones. The grand jury foreman, a retired military officer himself, listened intently as Bruce detailed his infiltration of the dependent network, his psychological manipulation of key participants, and his systematic documentation of federal crimes totaling nearly $50 million. "Sergeant Mercer," the foreman said when Bruce finished his presentation, "did you at any time develop genuine feelings for your wife during this undercover operation?" Bruce considered the question carefully. "Sir, the operational parameters required me to maintain emotional distance while simulating genuine attachment. Whether those simulated emotions became real is something I've been ordered not to examine too closely." "And the child your wife is carrying?" "DNA analysis confirms that the child is not biologically mine. It's the result of an extramarital affair that was part of her criminal pattern. The child will be placed in protective custody and adopted through appropriate channels." After Bruce's testimony, the grand jury voted to indict 237 individuals on federal conspiracy charges related to military fraud. The indictments would result in the largest prosecution of military family fraud in U.S. history. Wednesday morning, Detective Lake received his final briefing on the case. Agent Lutz walked him through the resolution of every aspect of the investigation, from Javier's cooperation agreement to Roxanne's expected plea bargain. "What about Bruce?" Lake asked. "What happens to him now?" "Sergeant Mercer will be receiving a commendation for exceptional service and will be promoted to Master Sergeant. He's being transferred to a new assignment where his unique skills can be utilized for similar operations. Similar operations? You mean there are other cases like this? Agent Lutz smiled grimly. Detective, military family fraud is a multi-billion-dollar problem. There are dozens of criminal networks operating across the country, and they all require the same kind of long-term infiltration and documentation that Bruce provided in this case. So he'll do this again? Marry another criminal and destroy her life. He'll do whatever his country requires him to do. That's what makes him valuable. Lake left the federal building with a profound sense of unease. He'd spent his career believing in justice, but what he'd witnessed in the Mercer case felt more like psychological warfare than law enforcement. Thursday morning, Roxanne pled guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering charges in federal court. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and supervised probation for the remainder of her life. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, Roxanne turned for one last look at the courtroom. In the back row, barely visible, sat Bruce Mercer in civilian clothes. He watched her with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout their marriage, giving no indication of emotion or satisfaction. Their eyes met for a moment, and Roxanne finally understood what Bruce had been trying to teach her all along. Consequences were the only truth that mattered, and justice was just another word for the price that had to be paid. Bruce nodded once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement between adversaries, then stood and walked out of her life forever. 3 months later, Master Sergeant Bruce Mercer reported to his new assignment in Colorado, where military intelligence had identified another criminal network that required infiltration and documentation. His cover identity was already prepared, a recently divorced soldier looking for love and a fresh start. The cycle would begin again, because there were always predators who thought they could exploit military families without facing consequences. Bruce Mercer's job was to prove them wrong, one marriage at a time. In his final report on the Dependent Network case, Bruce wrote, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered with precision and patience is justice perfected. The enemy's greatest weakness is their belief that good people won't become monsters to protect what matters." They're wrong. The report was classified at the highest levels, but its conclusions would influence military intelligence operations for decades to come. Sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become something more ruthless, more patient, and more absolute than they were. Bruce Mercer had learned that lesson well, and he would never forget it. Neither would his enemies.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.